Okay, everybody ready to roll? Here we go. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Thursday, October 24th, 2024 meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority. And we are handling these meetings as we are with our city council meetings online as well as in person. And if you want to participate in community comment, which is the only portion of the agenda this morning where we have an opportunity for public input, the code is up on the screen. It's going to come up fairly fast. And so the rest of us will be discussing we have just a singular matter in front of us this morning from not an action standpoint, but an informational standpoint. And so I'm going to now ask that the roll call be taken care of as I call the meeting to order. And I guess Scott Neal is going to handle the roll call this morning, our executive director.
Thank you,
multitasking, a new role.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Risser. Here. Commissioner Jackson.
Here.
Commissioner Pierce. Here. Commissioner Agnew.
Here.
Chair Hovland.
Here. We have next the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And we have a meeting agenda that's been published for all of us on the HRA and the public. Is there anyone that wishes to modify the agenda on staff or the HRA, any commissioner? Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda as published?
So moved.
Second.
Commissioner Jackson moves, Commissioner Pierce seconds the adoption of the meeting agenda as published. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adopting the meeting agenda as published, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. The meeting agenda as published is adopted. And now we are back at community comment. And so if there are folks that wish to call in, this would be a good time for you to think about getting online and getting ready. I'm going to ask if there's anybody in the audience who wishes to address the HRA in a matter of concern to them that's not otherwise on the agenda today or scheduled for a future public hearing. Seeing no one coming forward, turn to Director Benarott.
I don't yet have anyone on the line, but because there is a short delay in the broadcast, I would recommend waiting 1 minute or so to give people that opportunity. My clock shows that it's 7:34. I'll come back to you at 7:35 or when I have a caller, whichever's first.
Very good. Thank you.
A minute has now passed and I still don't have a caller, so I think it is safe for you to move forward with the agenda.
All right, very good, thank you. Our practice is to have the executive director comment on public comment that was made at the prior meeting. I don't think there was any comment.
There were no comments
report
at the
this morning.
previous meeting.
All right, and so we'll move on to the consent agenda. There's a couple items on the consent agenda, including one of our new acronyms to learn, LAHA. So we'll be learning more about that as time goes on. And nice of the legislature to put that in place so that we have some funds to work with on housing issues. Is there anyone who wishes to remove an item from the consent agenda? Is there a motion to adopt the items on the consent agenda?
So moved.
Commissioner Jackson moves.
Second.
Commissioner Pierce seconds the adoption of the items on the consent agenda in a single motion. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption of the items on the consent agenda in a single motion say aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried. Those items are adopted. And next, we are going to move on to the reports and recommendations portion of the agenda. We have no public hearing matters in front of us this morning. And so this is the continuation of the discussion on what might happen, what might be at what we call the Macy's site or the Enclave project. And one of the charges for the developer and for our staff was to look at what we could do in the on that site in the absence of tax increment financing usage or partial tax increment financing usage. And I think our staff and the developer have worked diligently on this over the past couple of weeks to be able to make a presentation to us this morning. So as we get into November, we're going to be making some decisions. We have a more well-rounded base of knowledge. So, Director, or Manager Neuendorf, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Well, as you had mentioned, we're still diligently working towards getting this full proposal in front of you, but we wanted to take this opportunity to continue the follow-up discussion that we started a few weeks ago. Similar to our presentation a few weeks back, I'll start with an overview, a little bit of information about some various scenarios and the fiscal impacts. And then I'm going to pause and turn it over to the developer, Patrick Brahma, who will go into a little bit more detail about what some of those alternatives might look like. I think that was responsive to your request last time. And then if after you see what the alternatives look like, that might put some of the numbers in context. I'm happy to come back and go through those in more detail or entertain questions. The packet is very heavy. There's lots of slides. Most of it is repeat from our conversation back in July and August. I did add a few new slides. So that's what I'm going to focus on this morning. But just be aware, I'm not going to go through that whole slide deck, but it's in there if there's any questions, and I'll kind of run through the highlights. Let's see. Yeah, maybe this battery is dead.
Sorry, I'll check it out.
Okay, there we go. All right, little technical error first thing in the morning. So an overview of this project. As we've mentioned for quite some time, after meeting with the developer, reviewing their pro forma, looking at their budgets, looking at the costs, looking at how the project has evolved, we still reach the same conclusion that without the use of tax increment financing to reimburse them for some costs in the future, this project is unable to proceed. It's unable to secure debt and equity to move forward. Staff still has the same recommendation that we consider the use of public financing. Thanks. As TIF to help get this project over the line and get the debt and equity signed up. A few questions to consider, and these are some questions similar, but just putting them front and center this time. When we use tax increment financing in Edina, in addition to all the provisions and restrictions of state law, we also add another measure, and that's to make sure that the project delivers not just benefit to the developer, but benefit to the general public. And that benefit is measured in a number of different ways. It trickles up through our policies and standards and guidelines that have evolved over decades and even some new ones in recent years. And they're articulated in our HRA Year in Review document. In that document, we update it each year, and there is a table where we just streamline look at some of the public benefits that are proposed, pending, and delivered. So to me, the fundamental question as we consider the use of tax increment financing here is whether or not they've delivered enough public benefit. We feel strongly that they've met all the standards in state law. We feel strongly that the site qualifies. We've, all the numbers add up, but there's still that gut check. Does it deliver enough public benefit? In recent weeks, you've asked about how could the site be redesigned or reconfigured to not use TIF. And fundamentally, that redesign would most likely not comply with our comprehensive plan, our small area plan, and many of our policies. So then the question is, do you have a preference? If we don't want to use tax increment here, instead, do we want to relax some of those policies and standards that have evolved? or fundamentally, the one other option is, should the project just not proceed? It's certainly within your authority to do that, to make that decision. So a quick reminder, the site, it's 8 acres, developed in the late 1970s. The site is under contract to the developer for purchase by Macy's, and they've got a purchase deadline that's coming up early January of next year. The development team is the same, Enclave Companies, a specialist in multifamily and commercial, and they're partnering on this site with lifestyle communities who will be doing the condominium building. The site plan is the same, and my apologies, I noticed this morning, this is actually the preliminary from the summertime, but this, just as a reference point, the site plan is still the same. Subdivide the site into 4 individual building pads for 4 separate buildings. The use of tax increment has been discussed in earnest over the last several months, but just a reminder that even when the developer came forward in March of 2023 in that first sketch plan, they raised the concern that based on the size and scope of the site that they felt that tax increment would most likely be needed. So that's how the site has evolved. A lot of public benefits. I'm not going to go through each of these, but this one I think is particularly of interest. All the space in red would be subject to some type of public easement, either a roadway easement, sidewalk easement, plaza easements, utility easements, parking easements. Typically, these types of buildings are all private property. And while it is privately owned, it would be available to the public. That's something that has worked well on other sites, and we'd like to continue that here. And then the most unique thing about this particular redevelopment site is the opportunity to potentially link the neighborhoods on the west side and east side of France Avenue with some type of public infrastructure. So far, we've been focused on more of an underpass. We've also considered a bridge that goes over the road to some degree. We started looking into that actually back in 2007. Was that first study to do some kind of pedestrian improvement that would separate people from the fast-moving traffic on France. With this particular redevelopment district, coupled with the site on the west side of the street, there might actually be an opportunity to deliver that. Don't want to raise our hopes up completely, though, because we haven't done all the study. We haven't done all the engineering. We've done enough to know that we think this could actually work. We still have to work on funding, financing, final design, all those crucial things. But with this particular site, how we've structured the arrangement with the developer is that 75% of the future incremental taxes would first be dedicated to reimburse the developer. And then the remaining 25% goes to the city for the public infrastructure. Typical tax increment deals, 90%, 95%, in some cases 100% of that revenue goes back to the developer. In this arrangement, we don't think that's warranted. Frankly, it's not necessary for the developer to meet their objectives. So we've purposely structured it that way to make sure that there'd be sufficient funding for the city if we really want to go forward with this type of public infrastructure.
Before you jump off of that slide, I think this is an important point that you just made, that the city would get a portion of the tax increment financing that would be used for repayment after the project was complete, that 25% of this would be coming back to the city during the life of the TIF district to assist us in some of the things that we want to accomplish. So what are, in addition to the potential passageway or some sort of crossing across France Avenue, what would be the other things that would be allowable use for us with that 25%?
Sure.
And I'm thinking of things that people have expressed concerns about. Well, there's going to be more people living there, and there's going to be more, burden on the rest of the general public. Can we be used to help defray some of those costs, even though we know the developer is going to take care of all of the things that we might normally take care of on the site, like sidewalk maintenance, street maintenance, those kinds of things. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So for this 25%, it really needs to focus on public infrastructure improvements. So roadway improvements, sidewalk and bike trail improvements, utility improvements, those types of general public purpose. It could also be pooled. That's a provision in tax increment law. It could be pooled for affordable housing inside the district or outside the district. And it could also be pooled for infrastructure within, not anywhere within the city, but within the Southeast project area. It could be pooled there. I don't know if we'd recommend that at this point, but that is a possibility. But with the 75%, part of the reason that number is where it is because the developer is already doing most of the public work. They're adding the new utilities. They're adding the new sewer. They're rebuilding Gallagher. They're rebuilding that sidewalk along France in that area. So some of those expenses are already covered. But the city could certainly do public infrastructure. We've done that in the Grandview district, where we use the taxes paid by the Avador building to fund the roads, sidewalks, new roundabouts on the west side of the highway. And with the Eden Wilson project, the old Perkins, the new Mason Green, we've done something similar where the tax revenue from that building has paid to redo all the roads here on the east side of the highway. So we could do something similar with this project. But at this point, what we're really focused on is the immediate needs at this site. So that's really where our attention has been.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Commissioner Risser this prompted her to have a question as well, or a comment.
And I have actually several questions and several concerns. And one is that embedded in the language of the TIF term sheet is a statement that the city and HRA currently believes it's in the best interest of the public to construct a public underpass or bridge to allow pedestrians and other non-motorized users, such as bicyclists and people who use devices, to cross France Avenue and located in the area of the project. And my concern is it was in this room February 15th, and I would encourage people to go back and look at that video of the HRA meeting. 10 minutes in, I'm saying that we need a study to go back to the drawing board. And this is in the context of being asked to approve an $80,000 professional service contract with LHB to look into a pedestrian crossing. And at that meeting, I was assured that we were going back to the drawing board, and that was what that contract was for. But I had reservations because the area being examined was so limited, and I specifically requested that the area be expanded so that it included Gallagher, because to me, it makes no sense to be investing apart from where the promenade, or excuse me, the bike trail already exists, and to be, thinking about not doing it at an intersection. And I was told, reassured by both colleagues and staff, that study would go back to the drawing board, and that would be what that was. I have not seen that study, even though we were told in the agreement that we would be getting a complete feasibility scope within 2 to 3 months. That was February, March, April, May. That study we have not had, and we were going to get the full scope in 4 months, June, okay? And it's October right now, and we have all this stuff in front of us, and we don't even have the basics of the study. And I also, at that meeting, expressed reservations about contracting with LHB because it wasn't an open process. And I really felt like, and we had received an email from a resident asking why there wasn't going to be an RFP. And at that meeting, I had a lot of reservations. I put them aside, and I supported voting for this contract. But since then, LHB is the entity that determined the Macy's site qualifies for TIF. Potentially, they are the ones, that's their drawing right there for the underpass. They haven't turned in this contract. And so as we're having this discussion, I am really having a hard time dealing with the basics of what we're talking about, because it really feels as if we're going about this in a very problematic way. The other thing is in terms of TIF financing, high level. This would be the third TIF district in a 2-block area on France for a project that was approved. The site plan is the PUD. We bundle, we mix all the colors of the pyramid of discretion into one singular vote. And so when we are rezoning, we are approving a site plan. And I have pushed back in the past about bundling that way, and I really have issues with that. But this would be the third time we did that. And so when we talk about, well, we need to make changes because otherwise this project can't move forward, this project is baked into the zoning. And I think, when we look at the U.S. Bank site and we look at the 7200, 7250 site, those are both TIF financed PUDs specific to a singular site plan. You look at the ordinance, it says, approved plans incorporated herein that were received by the city September 3rd. That is my understanding is that is the only thing that can be built on this site. And so to add TIF financing, public money to a project that can only be done by one developer really makes me incredibly uncomfortable. And I have to ask, because, I've been trying to figure, how did we get to where we are? And, is this a process that actually is okay? And I would like to hear the impression of our attorney on that. And specifically, the city is supposed to follow, if you look at state law and what we can zone for, there's a whole list of stuff that you can zone for. I don't see site plans on there. I don't see this level of granularity. So I'm wondering if that's an overreach. But, as I look at this and I think about where we are right now, it's frustrating on so many levels. And, as an elected official, I'm trying to do what I swore I would do when I accepted this position. And I just feel like so much is coming at me that I have a lot of questions about.
That was a lot. I don't know if
that was a lot.
I'll try to.
But yeah.
Would it be appropriate if I responded to some, maybe in the order that you presented some of your questions? I might not catch all of them, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Kendall if you wanted a response from him, if that's okay, Chair.
Yes, I think so. I tried to jot down some of them too.
So the study on the pedestrian crossing, that contract was approved back in February. The time frame did not align. It is taking longer to produce that. The biggest part of that was that the architects and engineers were working hand in hand with the developers. So they don't want to work, they don't want to come up with some scenario, some conceptual design that was impossible because it didn't match up with the site plan. So it was an iterative process. The site plan finally got locked in June, which then allowed the engineers on our side to at least put one pin in the place, knowing that, okay, that preliminary plan is approved, so we know that's where the corner of the building is. We know that's where the curb is going to be. We know that's where the sidewalk is going to be. So that was a delay, definitely. The engineering team did present an update to us and gave us a draft report. I forgot the meeting date, August or September. And the final still is pending. We still do owe you the final, and that is coming. We've aligned it so that when all these items go together for a final vote, that document would be available in advance of that. So you have that final report rather than the draft. And the final report does address this the scope expansion that you had requested. So it goes from the southern edge of Gallagher to the northern edge of 72nd Street. That's the focus area. As I recall, back in February, there was conversation as well of, well, should we do something up by the mall, up by 66th Street or 69th Street? And that's a great question. Maybe we should, but our focus now is on these areas that we know are changing and that we know there's an opportunity in front of us here. So that's how we determine the scope of that work. So I do expect that report. It is coming. It should be on the November 14th meeting agenda.
Member, yes. Commissioner, go ahead.
When you say working hand in hand with the developers, that's not really.
That didn't come out right, did it?
That's
Sorry to
not what
interrupt.
I thought that study was going to be about. And I do have reservations about how the location of it. And we did get financing here in Edina for a bridge across France Avenue. And I think it was part of the outcome from the 2005 study. People decided not to pursue that bridge, but instead, and got permission to use the funding to make safety improvements at grade level. And we have invested in at grade level crossing. And when I hear about how, okay, well, maybe what we'll do is we'll reroute part of the 9 Mile Creek Trail so that it's not on the south side of Gallagher when you're at the west side of France, but instead on the north side, I feel like that's ignoring a lot of the investment that has already gone in by the city to do the at-grade improvements. So there's a lot of parts here that are moving, and it is really concerning. But okay, thank you for that response.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, if I could correct one statement. When I said they were working hand in hand with the developers, please don't take that out of context. My intention is that the engineers that we hired, that the city hired, that the HRA hired, were working hand in hand with the engineers that have intimate knowledge of those two private projects, because we didn't want to design this potential public improvement with blinders on. And so the engineers got together and talked about how their water flows on their site, where their elevations are, where their grades are, where their critical utilities are. It was those types of conversations, so that altogether, if this is decided to move forward, all those three pieces would match up. The piece on the east side of the road, the piece out, the city's piece in the road, and then the developer's piece on the other side of the road. So those conversations are essential for good projects to work.
And the tunnel concept has changed. Initially it was going to look like what goes on at York, and it was going to be open and very light. And then we learned that no, it's only going to be a 10-foot wide area of light coming through, and then it was going to be a 50-foot wide tunnel, and then it's going to be 25 feet. And I just feel like it keeps moving away from something where people might feel comfortable. And I do know, the one thing I could find, which is in that promenade report, in regard to grade separated crossings at France Avenue, due to the length of the crossing and due to the difficulties of making tunnels safe and comfortable, it is recommended that overpasses be used instead of underpasses. And so, if you're looking, I'm growing increasingly concerned. And I want to say for the record, even though it says in the TIF draft that we see this, the HRA considers this a public benefit, I, as a member of the HRA, do not see a tunnel at this location under France as a public benefit. And
All right, thanks for that observation. You also had a question from Commissioner Risser about the process that we're using here.
Yeah, with the zoning process, I would defer that to Carrie Teague or Dave Kendall. I'm not an expert to speak about the zoning law.
There was a question about or comment about this being the third PUD in a 3-block area. Any observations on that?
That's accurate. There's several parcels that are zoned PUD in Edina, certainly several on France Avenue, others throughout other neighborhoods as well.
It was also commenting that, and I do believe all 3 PUDs zoned specifically to the site plans, and would like feedback on that and how it lines up with Minnesota law about zoning and what municipalities can do.
You mean the fact that the PUDs have their own site plans because they're PUDs? Is that what you mean?
The reality that when we vote to approve a site plan, we are voting to approve to rezone. They are bundled together. We are mixing. And the thing is, I'm trying to figure out how we can have two PUDs on France Avenue that aren't exactly moving forward. We're talking about creating a third. And what exactly is it that is causing, or, is this a factor? Is our approach to development something that's stymieing development? Because the only thing that can go up are the site plans that the developer has proposed. They're baked into the zoning. Is it okay to bake in site plans to the zoning? Is that okay? Is it in alignment with Minnesota law?
Director Teague, you want to come up and comment on it? And then we can go to our attorney, too.
Yeah, I believe the question was legal, but that is the intent of the PUD. We're baking in that site plan in the approvals within the ordinance that's the only project that can be built on that site. I'll turn it over to Mr. Kendall.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, that's correct. So this is the nature of PUD, that the zoning requires that particular project to be built. I think when you're doing a PUD, I think it's appropriate and necessary probably to have a site plan required by that PUD, because the nature of PUD is you want that particular project built in that way. That's what you've discussed and negotiated for. If the question relates to whether the HRA is, because the city council has approved PUD zoning on that site, whether the HRA is then somehow required to approve TIF, I don't think it is. It's two separate bodies acting in two separate capacities. So the HRA is free to decide not to approve TIF. If that happened, then presumably either the developer would have to come back and ask for a change to the PUD zoning to some kind of different or smaller scale project, or they'd have to go back to the private market and see, once again, if they could try to obtain additional financing to build the approved project. But the HRA is not required to approve TIF simply because the city council has approved PUD zoning. And I think that is, something that the council, when approving or reviewing PUD zoning, just has to be aware of. You are approving that particular site plan, and if it's a large, complex, expensive site plan, it may be difficult to line up financing for that, and the developer may have problems with that, and they may have to come back in at some point and ask you to somehow change that site plan. So that's a potential danger, drawback issue to using PUD. There's upside and downside, but that's one of the downsides, is that if you have a large, complex, expensive PUD, it may be some time and some difficulty before it gets built.
All right, and then you had remarked, Commissioner, that these were TIF finance plans along France Avenue. I would characterize it differently myself. They were TIF assisted plans. The bulk of the financing is coming from equity and debt, I would think, from the developers, and not from the city. We're assisting on public benefit elements of these things.
That's correct, yeah. And I don't recall the exact price tag of each of those projects off the top of my head this morning, but the proposal at 70th and France, multi-phase, 4 different buildings. The first one was finished. The second and third ran into financing issues, as we do know about. But the 70th in France, as well as the 72nd in France, are designed to follow the city's policy and best practices. So those projects are fully privately funded, at least theoretically. The one at 70th is delayed. And then TIF is used after the project is finished, after those public benefits are delivered. Then a TIF note is issued to reimburse that developer for that set amount that was predefined. But the first step in each and every project in Edina is that first they have to secure that private funding. At the property across the street from this, the Macy's Furniture site, the 7200 site, My understanding is that the developer is moving forward. They're working on getting a foundation permit at this point on the office building. They're still hoping to break ground this fall. It's getting tight to break ground on that, but my understanding is that their financing did finally come through. Their private financing took much longer than anyone ever expected. But those projects, I think you address it very clearly, Mr. Chair, that the private funding comes first. That the debt and the equity that's the developer's responsibility. After they finish their projects, that's when the TIF would actually be repaid over time.
One of the other, Commissioner Risser wasn't around when we did those at-grade crossings, but the comment that we've invested in at-grade crossings, that's a county road, and actually that money came from the Met Council, as I recall. We were talking about doing an overhead passageway, and then we ended up doing 3 crossings at grade because of some of the challenges we found around an overhead.
Yeah, my recollection, I just started here at that time. I think that was 2014 or 2015. We did have a federal grant that came through the Met Council for the bridge, and I was not here when the decision was made not to do the bridge, the overhead bridge, but those dollars got the project started. The county was not able or willing to step up, so the city stepped up. We actually used TIF money from the Centennial Lakes TIF district to supplement the budget and get the rest of those 3. We had the crosswalks, we had all the intersection improvements. My recollection was about, probably more than half of that project cost came from Centennial Lake TIF dollars that were available for infrastructure improvements.
Okay. So that the purpose of our gathering this morning was to kind of learn what we could do at that site, the Macy's site, the Enclave site, in the absence of TIF or with more limited use of TIF. And now we're running into some potential time issues here. So let's try to push forward on this purpose of this meeting this morning.
Yes, thank you. Will do. Let me just cut to the chase for this morning. At our last conversation, we were asked to look at some alternatives. So the developer has done that, and then I did some estimates based on some of those alternatives. So some of these might make more sense after you see what Patrick is going to present, but we were asked about the park maintenance fees. So in Edina, we've got a long history of having private developments that are right on parks help fund those maintenance and operations in the park. They don't pay for all of it, but it's those fees that help reduce the cost burden to the overall taxpayer. So with this proposal, this is one thing that we talked a lot about this one, but where we landed, and Patrick, just close your ears right now. So this project, it'll pay about $80,000 in fees annually that would be restricted to maintenance of Centennial Lakes Park and that promenade. That would last for 30 years with an annual escalator each year. And then at the end of that term, it would expire and wind down. That's similar to agreements that were made with developers in this area for the last 30 years. So that's the orange line is those park fees. The blue line on the bottom is what we've received from this site for the last 40 years, which is nothing, at least as far as the park fees. So if TIF is not used on this site, the city loses the leverage to ask the developers to help out with the park. The only way that we can get these fees is if we use TIF and as a condition of getting that financial support. So that's what that looks like. And then I try to model a couple other things, and these are just caveats. I'll talk through them when we go here. Let me just say it's tough to model hypothetical situations, right? There's so many variables. We don't control any of those variables. With this analysis, I try to bookend a couple things. So I know where we are today. As is, the property pays $348,000 a year in property taxes. Each year, $45,000 in change comes to the city. Half goes to the state, fiscal disparities, some to the schools, and some to the county. But if we look over a 26-year period, which is that lifespan of a redevelopment TIF district, the city would receive $1.18 million over that 26-year period. We were asked hypothetically at the last meeting, well, what if Macy's sold and renovated the property and a new user came in and did something? A lot of guesses here, but so if we doubled the value, I think that was the ask to us at the last meeting. What if that value doubled? Well, then the benefit to the city doubles. We'd receive a little bit over $2 million over the next 26 years. The state would still get their half, the county gets some, the schools get some. One caution is that properties like this in the last several years have been of high interest by nonprofit users. Churches, houses of worship, places like that. Over the last several years, I do get, on a relatively frequent basis, inquiries from expanding, growing churches that are looking for big sites on big roads so they can attract big audiences to their worship services. And that's great, and that's allowed, and all those good things, but they're tax exempt. So one of the dangers, just to remind folks, is once they're exempt, they might pay nothing in property taxes. So just a caution there. And then here's the other thing that we do know. Don't have a ton of control, but the chart on the bottom is the 26-year cumulative payments that the city would recognize if we choose to use tax increment financing and see this project being built. So I'll start on the left of this chart. The green box is those city taxes. The one little bit over $1 million, $45,000 a year. When TIF is used, that base is frozen initially, right? That's the concept of TIF. But when that happens on this site, the developer, thanks to city's policies and standards and laws, also has to pay about $1.8 million to our water fund to make sure that all the water pipes in Edina can keep delivering water to the community. They pay about $1.6 million to our sewer fund to make sure the sewer pipe works, and when you flush the toilet, it goes where it needs to go. Since they're subdividing the site, they're paying just under $3 million in park dedication fees. That's a check that's written to the city that can be used for any park, for any improvement in any park citywide. The second green box is that cumulative amount of park maintenance fees. That adds up to another $3 million. So with this project, if this project moves forward with TIF, you've got $9.6 million that comes to the city, either upfront or spread out over the term. And then the big blue bar there, that's the 25% of the tax increment this project would generate. So that could be used by the city to fund an underpass, an overpass, sidewalks. We could pool it for affordable housing in other places. Any legal use by state law would be eligible for that amount. So that total dollar amount comes to about $40 million over 26 years. And then here's the last hypothetical I have for you. This is our estimate at the taxes generated to the city if the city approved an alternative plan, and that's what Patrick's going to show in a minute. If we approved a different plan without TIF. So if that were the case, there's a lot of caveats to get to that alternative plan, but the tax increment would not become tax increment. It would just be regular taxes. So the dollar amount to the city would be higher up front. They would still have to pay the sewer fee. They'd still have to pay the water fee. But they would not have to have the infrastructure fee through the TIF. They wouldn't have any of the park fees. That dollar amount over 26 years comes to $26 million. So there's a spread of about $15 million benefit to the city at large if we use TIF versus if we had an alternative plan where we did not use TIF. Patrick's going to show you a little bit more about that alternative plan, but to suffice it to say that plan, based on staff's quick review, it probably would not be approved because it doesn't comply with our comprehensive plan, our affordable housing plan, our sustainability plan, or our small area plan. But hypothetically, that's what it would look like.
I just had one on this slide. The only thing I would ask for differently And I think we should be showing both sides of it every time we look at a project. I think for me, this feels like maybe the first time we've gone through this level of specificity and looking at the financials in this way. And so I think it's very additive and it's a good part of the process. The only thing I would add here, and I think you kind of spoke to it, would be what is the difference between with no TIF, once the project is done and we can estimate, say, 2 years, how does that impact the tax, both the capacity and the funds available, right? And then with TIF, once the district is decertified, that's the point where, right, the tax base, the capacity shifts, and then there's more dollars available. I'd want to see that along with those. So I'm not asking a question. I'm making a request the next time we do this that we're able to show that as well.
We'll definitely have that for you. In fact, Ellers is working on that. I just got a draft last night, so we'll get it to you at the next one.
Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner.
I also really like this slide, and I think it helps show the picture numerically, and I think that's always a struggle that we have. I know that this is intended to be the financial impact specifically to our city. I also think it would be helpful as we're having discussions to potentially add into this view. I know we have other views of this, but impacts to the school district and potentially the county taxes as well. Just because we continue to get questions about that, and I think this visual in particular could be really instrumental in showing those other impacts.
Sure. Happy to do that. We did do something similar in the last several presentations. This chart that showed the benefit to the schools get their benefit right away. If the project moves forward, if the project does not move forward, it all stays the same. But yeah, we can think about doing it in that bar chart fashion.
Yeah, I think the visual is what's impactful in this one. So thank you.
Go back to that one you were just on again. So if there's an alternative project, non-TIF related, there would not be a park dedication fee?
It depends on what that hypothetical project is.
Okay.
There might be, but hypotheticals are tough. I mean, as we started to lay these out, it didn't comply with any of our standards, and it's hard to make guesses like that.
So I would say that, to the points that Commissioners Pierce and Agnew just made, I'd just say it a slightly different way. The pros and cons of whether it's worthwhile to wait for the increment period to capture the increased value over the base value or the value of a project that's done without TIF. Kind of saying the same thing a different way.
For sure, that's what I'm thinking the comparison actually is. Yeah.
So, because I think that ends up being a judgment call because of the variables involved. And so, but the more information we can have to help us make those judgments is really good. So anyway, go ahead.
So in the chart, there's also a graph here that may or may not be helpful. I want to be mindful of time here as well. So these are the same 5 hypotheticals: the as-is condition, which is the top red line, and then the approved plan condition, which is the bottom green line. This measures the different types of fees that the city receives, and a lot of those fees would be used to offset tax levies or to supplement a future tax levy. And then the right half of this graph or this chart shows the various public benefits: remediation of environmental issues, creation of new jobs, new housing, new affordable housing, compliance with that South Dale plan to make that whole area more walkable and livable, the sustainability goals, the idea of moving towards more of a public parking structure rather than everything being private and duplicative, and the new streetscape, new plazas, those types of things. So with these, with the as-is condition, obviously it is what it is. nothing wrong with what it is, but there's no direct benefit to the city at this point. And then some of those hypotheticals that provide various levels of benefit or not. So I just want to make sure we've got plenty of time for Mr. Brahma. He's why we're here this morning. But just questions to consider. Going back to where we started, does this project deliver a suitable degree of public benefits? It is designed to comply with all the codes and with all the standards and guidelines and whatnot in the city. And if some of those standards need to be relaxed to move this forward without TIF, which one should be relaxed? We've got a lot of standards that have been around. The affordable housing has been a goal since the 1970s. That more recent policy was adopted in 2015 after a lot of input. The sustainability, the Southdale plan, years of community input on those. So if we do need to relax some of them, it'd be helpful to understand which one and how we might go about doing that. And then another option is, should other public financing alternatives be considered? We put this out on the table back in August. There are alternatives to doing TIF notes. What Edina did back in the 80s and 90s is we just went and bought land rather than having a developer do it. For example, the city bought the gravel pits, and we put that money out there, and we sat on the land, and when the office market was ready, we sold that piece, and when the housing was ready, we sold that piece. That's another strategy. It's much more aggressive. And doesn't really comply with our current TIF policy, but that's still an option. But just a couple of questions for thought there as you consider what Mr. Brahma has to share. So I'm going to wrap it up there and turn it over to Mr. Brahma to run through. He's going to start where he finished last meeting, and then supplement it with some images to help put it in greater context.
Good. Thanks, Manager Nunendorf. Mr. Brahma? You get to be the star of the show here again as we talk about alternatives to what was approved from a project standpoint as we look at this potential use of tax increment financing.
Good morning, Chair, members of the Commission. Good to be with you again. As Mr. Neuendorf had mentioned, we connected with the HRA back on the 10th of October. We went through a presentation that was a little bit more text-driven without images. It was basically going through a table that answered a few questions that we were asked. I'm not going to repeat kind of the text side of things and the table side of things that we went through at that meeting unless I'm asked. I'm happy to go back through that if desired. But I'm going to spend more time on the visuals of those different questions. So I'm going to go through this chart that we went through before, and we'll flip back and forth between this chart and some visuals. Feel free to interrupt me along the way. So the first question that we were asked, would the project happen, the project that was approved on the 17th of September, if TIF was not available? If it isn't clear, just the answer is no. This project wouldn't occur but for TIF. There is a financial gap. We've known that there'd be some sort of financial gap or need for TIF. We didn't know the exact amount until we got through further into city approval process. We knew exactly what it was we were building and what policies we need to comply with to what degree. However, we always knew that there'd be a financial gap. We attempted to be transparent about that from the very first written application we made. That wasn't even TIF related. It was land use related back in 2023, but tried to communicate that along the way. The current site, the way it is today, if TIF wasn't available, we understand that the site would just continue on the way that it is. We say that in the context that we approached Macy's. Macy's did not approach us. We actually worked on trying to get a purchase agreement for over a year. It was tough to get it under contract. We understand that they're comfortable continuing to operate their store as is. And would into the future. And as far as hypotheticals, what would happen if our project did or did not move forward, I don't want to answer that on behalf of Macy's. Our understanding is they would continue operating. Lots of text here. Again, we went through it in a little bit more programmatic way in our last meeting, but kind of took that first question and then started pairing it backwards or looking backwards. So what would we need to change to that project that was approved on the 17th of September to make it work without TIF? So we went through 4 or 5 items and talked through that. We also put dollar values in connection to those 4 or 5 items. I do want to, this is a little bit of a repeat, so I apologize for the commission members, but just for the sake of anybody watching from the public, I just want to be transparent that we're not asking for this or requesting it. The developer's not proposing these items. The main reason why we wouldn't propose this or request this is we respect that these aren't minor requests, these are major requests, complete change to city policies, vision, strategic, or excuse me, comprehensive plan. So we just, from a core value perspective, Enclave does not, we try to avoid going to cities with asking for too many changes to the city's policies, procedures, comprehensive plan, those types of things. We try to fall in line with those items to the best of our ability. So if we were talking about one item, perhaps we would feel better about coming to the city and making those requests. But in this case, we think this is a significant enough of a list that we wouldn't make the request. So putting a visual to that, this is the Macy's site. In this previous screen here, we did outline verbally what the project would look like. Here is a visual. I'm going to throw out some caveats before I start explaining what is proposed here. This is utilizing a program called TestFit. It is a pretty, in today's day and age, it's actually pretty advanced software, and you can do a pretty quick sketch of a project, and it looks semi-realistic pretty fast. But for the caveats, this is basically back of napkin level of sophistication. This is, if it was 20 years ago, it would have been someone taking a marker and drawing on a sheet of paper or overlay of a site. So this is something that I did, the developer did. This is not an architect or a licensed designer. The intent here is schematic. It's meant to just show space and mass and help us identify roughly the number of units and kind of the scale of a project. So what we're looking at here, is mentioned in the text side of things, is breaking this site up into 2 blocks rather than 4. We would be looking at 5/2 buildings, so 5 stories of wood, which are colored in white, over 2 stories of concrete colored in gray. These buildings would look and feel kind of like a mix of like the 71 France project to the north and the Fred. I say the Fred because the Fred's a large building. Those are large buildings with large unit counts, whereas 71 France, those buildings are broken up a little bit more. But the exterior design, the look and feel, the height would be some sort of mix between those 2 projects. There are some caveats that I can go through in this design, just for the sake, again, because this is so rough. We wouldn't propose literally this. There'd have to be exterior design that looks nice. We'd have walkout units against the promenade that are shown in peach here. We would assume that we'd have some small piece of commercial on the corner against Gallagher. We'd do some refining on the 7th floor of certain portions of the building to have step backs, but this is the hypothetical image of the discussion that we had on the 10th. I anticipate there might be questions on this specifically, so I'm going to pause and then I can go through my last slides.
Yep, Commissioner Mercer.
I do have a question about eliminating the affordable housing. And specifically in the PCD 3 district, multi-residential uses are allowed as a conditional use, but it's required that new rental housing will remain affordable for a minimum of 20 years if seeking a PUD, and it does go through the amount of anything over 20 units. So this is part of our municipal code for the PCD 3 subdistrict, that if multifamily is included, there has to be that affordable housing component. If city financing is approved, then it needs to be in place for 30 years. So I just want to underscore that. I guess it's more of a comment than a question.
Commissioner Mercer, was that in the context of a PUD?
In a PUD, there is language about that, but it also addresses financing and the range of it. So I just want everybody aware that in our code for the PCD 3 subdistrict, if we're adding residential to the commercial, that is an element of it, a requirement, a code requirement.
So just to be clear, maybe Director Teague could come up. So my understanding from the affordable housing policy is that if the developer wanted something from us, PUD or a variance, anything of that nature, then the affordable housing policy comes into play. If they built a project that was in compliance with the existing code for that particular zoning district, do they still have to comply with affordable housing requirements?
They do. Within the PCD 3 district, the section that was referred to, affordable housing is a requirement.
Other questions for Mr. Brahma? Comments? This is all residential now, no retail, no restaurants. Is that right?
Other than that portion that's highlighted in blue, yes, it would be just a single-use market rate apartments.
Other questions or comments from commissioners? Oh, and this is, go ahead. You have some.
Yeah, this is
what you have approved.
This is the current project, but yeah,
Yeah.
so everybody's aware of this. That's all I have.
What was the on the hypothetical model? What was the setback from the promenade versus under the hypothetical versus under the approved plan?
Because this is a pretty rough design, the setbacks aren't fully resolved, but what you're looking at there right now in that bottom right image, it's showing the promenade closer to the bottom of the screen there. The setbacks, when you compare and contrast, the setbacks of the current project range from the currently approved project. So the next slide, range from 35 to 90 feet setback. What you're looking at there is 25 to about 90 feet setback. With that being said, because this is a crude initial design, there are some pushes and pulls in this design. For example, that I have is the south side of that building. So if you're looking at that bottom right image, that the south side, so against pinstripes, is actually set back further from that property line than even our currently approved design. So likely we would pull back from the promenade a little bit, push back closer to pinstripes a little bit, and to make up the difference. So the net difference between the two projects would be it wouldn't be drastic. We could get semi-close.
And was there any estimate on your part of the cost or the value of that hypothetical project upon completion? We're talking now about, I think if I remember right, we're in the $300 million range for the total value, market value of the project that was approved. This one, was it 2/3 of that, or do you have any just hypothetical range of value compared to what we approved?
I ran a very rough analysis, and I know I have that number exists. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head because I was focused on cash flow. Cash flow is what drives the financial gap and the need for assistance. So I end up focusing everything on the cash flow over time to figure out what the financial gap is. But I can follow up with staff, get that number. I don't recall. It would be less. I don't remember exactly how much less.
Okay, yeah. I don't want you to guess, but just I know there's an element of guesstimation that would go on regardless, but it might be helpful for us. Other questions at this point in time? Manager Newendorf, anything else that you wanted to add? I think that might have been, that's the only thing on our agenda.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything new, but just the reminder, when I showed those bar charts with the various estimates, when I modeled this one, again, very rough numbers. My assumption was that the project cost was about the same. We haven't looked at this thoroughly, but also a reminder, with this hypothetical alternative, I keep reinforcing the word hypothetical because, as I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but to make this financeable without tax increment, they would ask for a waiver from that ordinance about affordable housing. They'd ask for a waiver from the sustainability policy. They'd most likely ask for a park dedication waiver if one would be applicable here. and then they wouldn't be able to divide the property into those smaller blocks. So each of these 2 buildings would be pretty massive in scale, which is what we've been trying to get away from in that whole Greater Southdale plan. So there's a lot of caveats, a lot of concern. Staff has not fully vetted these drawings for anything, but just based on what Mr. Brahma had told us at our last meeting about the need to bring the cost down, we know that there'd be a lot of waivers that would be requested. So we modeled it as best we can, taking a quick look, but just a reminder that there's a lot of concerns with that.
Okay, Commissioner Jackson has a question, and I think I've got a wrap up for you.
Yeah, this is a zoning question. So this is what's allowed, the size, the height is what's currently allowed in this district. This would not be a PUD, is that correct?
Yeah, if this were to come in under the PCD3 zoning, the current zoning on the site, this project wouldn't come close to meeting our setback standards, floor area ratio standards. It might meet height. I don't recall exactly the height limitation there, but it definitely, they would need to seek a lot of variances.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. That's very helpful.
But,
Mr. Pierce.
but just so I'm sure I'm understanding the right context, I think your response to the question is accurate, so I'm not challenging that. But I think we're using the current paradigm to answer that particular question. So if this came forward, we would be looking through the lens of the comp plan, our current policies, all of that. Is that correct?
We would. We'd still be looking at the comprehensive plan,
Right.
the zoning, the district guidelines.
Which,
yes.
which totally makes sense. And so the ask and the issue is, I personally think some of this really should be part of the process much earlier, right? When we talked about in the past, a sketch plan review was, I even heard Mayor, you even say, like it could be on the back of a napkin. Like we didn't want developers to spend $2 million to get to a point where there's a preliminary approval on a sketch plan. And so the questions, I'm trying to figure out a way in our process, which is not this. We're using this project to have this conversation, but to tee up choices we can make. And so we don't have those choices in front of us today because we've got the comp plan. We've got these policies that we've already agreed to. But the council could make a different decision to say, well, yeah, to your point, we're going to relax a particular policy to reduce the amount of TIF to get a project done. Like those kinds of trade-offs. That's all that's what I'm after, right? And so I think it's important that when we answer that question, we're using the current lens that we look through, that we operate through, which is totally fair, right? But that's actually not the question that's not the reason the question was asked. And so I just want to be clear about that as we go forward. So thank you.
Commissioner Risser.
I want to echo Commissioner Pierce's points. And actually, when I watched the meeting that I missed, I literally thought we should have had this dialogue months ago, if not a year ago. And I also want to say that just in terms of transparency and what the public is seeing, when you look at the request on Better Together for this project to be rezoned to PUD, it says, in return for providing affordable housing and a building that meets sustainable building policy, comma, and then the applicant is requesting, and there's a list of things that have to do with, physical variances that they will need. But the implication is that this is something the developer will provide, not something that is dependent to a certain degree on public financing. And that needs to be out there early on so that the public, if they're going to respond to this, they'll be able to respond to this. Also, the language I'm uncomfortable seeing at the very beginning, it gets confusing and obscure because We're saying they're going to provide affordable housing, but it's a requirement that they meet because it is PCD3. And so that, there needs to be more clarity on that point. And I know I've spoken out about this before, but I keep seeing commercial land being transformed into market rate residential. And when I see the proposal without TIF, again, we have commercial land going market rate residential. My neighborhood, it's happened on 3 parcels. It's purely residential on commercial land. It's not compliant. But we just find ways to keep doing that. And I fear we're going to lose the diversity of our land and what we can and cannot do with it. So there's those concerns.
Thank you. Commissioner Agnew.
Thank you. I agree with my fellow commissioners that I definitely want us in the future to be having these conversations earlier. I think we need to kind of emphasize what are the other alternatives as we're going throughout this process. And still, I don't know that would have changed things in this project, because throughout, I think that this developer has been responsive to the questions that we've had or the direction that we've had. There's been a lot of transformation of this project, and I'm really excited about it. I think it is what we need for this area. And so I love this exercise. I want us to do it earlier next time. But I just want to add that there was a lot of excitement when we approved this. And I think that more information is always better, but I don't know that it would have been material and change the outcome of where we're at. So I think what we do is we learn and we iterate on the process. But we also can't go back in time on this project in particular. And so we can choose to not approve it, right? Like, obviously, yes. But I always think, what are those actual alternatives? This one presented here, sure, it's one alternative. It probably wouldn't have been approved because it was one big wall along France. And yes, it didn't meet all of the needs. But I do continue to question, like, what would be something that we want to see as a city here? And we've all infused those ideas and those visions to make this project what it is today. And it isn't just market rate housing, right? There's a lot of it, but there's also retail. There's also office space. There are a lot of components that we want to have in this site. So I know that this is important conversation, but I just wanted to root us in that as we continue the dialogue. Thanks
for that. Mr. Brahma, would you come up for just a moment? I want to make sure that, and I think it was on your third slide. This is to reinforce, I think, the conversation up here, particularly Commissioner Pierce's comments, that I understood you to say that with respect to item number 2, shift land use strategy, those are items you said, I understood, that Enclave would never ask of us because, or variance from those rules and guidelines in the context of making a request. Just to reinforce that, was that a correct understanding on my part?
Yes, that is the correct answer. And it's all about degrees. So, it's one thing, hey, we need a variance of 5 feet of a setback on one side of a building. That happens, I guess I don't want to suggest anything for what you would approve or not, but that's not uncommon for someone to ask for like a small single off request. But these are not small, from our perspective, a small request. These are strategic shifts that are major requests in our viewpoint. And that's why we wouldn't take these lightly, and we wouldn't come to the city with this level of request. It would, right. To me, that sounds like a policy discussion, not a developer request.
So Member Jackson asked that key question about underlying zoning, and Director Teague came up and talked about that this project would never comply with PUD 3, but I think what I heard you saying was that on the hypothetical project, that is what you could build and make it work. But it just in the absence of any of the considerations around PUD 3. And if you looked at the requirements of PUD 3 in depth, you might not even be able to go forward with the project. Is that a fair
Oh, yes, that's correct. It wouldn't, yep. And hence the reason, so that slide you're referring to, number 2, was, yeah, that shift in
That was
land
the
use.
inference that I got from it, and I just wanted to
That's right.
understand it
That's
better,
correct.
that you weren't coming and saying, this is what we could build, and you should approve this. You were just saying, this is what it would look like.
Correct. If we were going to make it work with no assistance at all, correct.
That cause anybody else to have any follow-on? Okay, Commissioner Jackson.
So I just want to kind of go back to something that Mr. Neuendorf said, that an alternative would be for the city to buy the land and then develop it. And I feel like in a lot of these conversations, it's this struggle we have back and forth between the city being a real estate developer and having a private real estate market come to us with ideas. And I just keep thinking about the Grandview Public Works site. It's still empty. And we've tried that. And it's incredibly complex for us as a city council to be real estate developers. And I just wanted to put that point out there.
Or is the HRA, you mean?
Or as the HRA, yeah. Both, yeah, that's right, it's the HRA, it's Thursday morning. But it's incredibly complex. We don't have the staff that a developer has for economic modeling and looking at financing and everything. So it would be a massive change in how we do business if we wanted every site to be developed according to what we as an HRA have in mind, rather than inviting public developers to come forward. So I just wanted to put that out there.
So, Mr. Neuendorf, what I kind of captured is, I think, 2 of the key questions, and maybe you raised this at the beginning, or Commissioner Risser. As we get to this discussion in November, is there sufficient public benefit being delivered? Give us your thoughts again on that. Make sure that we understand that clearly. And then I think the second question was, what we've been going through here with this process, is it worthwhile to wait for the increment period to expire to capture the increased value over the base value, or the value of a non-TIF project over that same period of time? So if that's articulated very well.
I think I know what you're saying. To me, those are the 2 fundamental questions as you consider whether or not to help with the financing on this project. The financing is a request by the developer. I think Mr. Kendall very clearly stated it's optional. We don't have to get involved. The project would not move forward, but that's not really our problem. That's the developer's risk. That's why they're in that industry. So as we work with our advisors at Ehlers and Dorsey and Whitney, of course, we always make sure that we follow state law and have all the financials and all the legal matters resolved. But fundamentally, it still comes down to, is this a project that meets the state law plus our local policies? And we define our local policy as that public benefit. So if you feel that it passes that test, that might inform your decision. Yeah. So we are queued up. So November 14th, we're expecting to come back to the HRA with 3 massive redevelopment contracts for your consideration, with the report on the pedestrian crossing, the final report, and then the resolution for the TIF district, and then that would roll over into the city council approvals later in the month. So that's where we're aiming, based on conversations with the developer. He thinks he can still get on that schedule. He thinks he can still get to the closing date, and we'll try our best to get there if that's your direction.
Commissioner Risser has maybe the wrap-up comment or question?
One other question, and I really want this addressed because of the way we do the PUD, and it is site-specific. I really want assurance that awarding TIF to such a development is okay. And here's the thing. I know PUDs can be created so that what's defined is the amount of green space or pervious surface that has to remain, the amount of, you can set up a PUD without having to anchor it to a specific site project. And I really need to know if what we're doing is okay, and if it is okay, are there any complications of awarding TIF to that? Because it's a lot of public financing, and it's flowing to one specific developer's project. So I would like to have clarity on that by November. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else from anybody? Anything for the good of the order? Mr. Executive Director, anything for us?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're still working on, I got good input, helpful input from all of you on HRA schedules. We're still working on that. Should be coming back to you in November.
All right, is there a motion to adjourn? We
So
made
moved.
it.
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. Was it Commissioner Jackson that moved? All right, and Commissioner Pierce seconds the motion to adjourn. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. HRA this Thursday, October 24th, 2024 stands adjourned.